But yeah, just to introduce everyone, this is Hugh from Disability Sports Coach. I'm sure he'll give you a bit more information about the charity, but I just thought I'd introduce him. Right, that's recording now, Hugh.
This is recording, okay. Just bear with me a second. So I'm having some other issues now. Oh, there we go. Right, okay. I think I'm almost there. Great, okay. Can everyone see the screen? We all okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, first of all, to Lauren and Connor for giving this opportunity to come along and talk to you about disability awareness in sport. I don't know how many of you know much about our organisation. So just very quickly, what we're going to do, we're going to look at have a 1 hour course here. We do have a full 3 hour accredited disability awareness in sport course. And if you kind of find this particular session interesting, then please have a sort of consider actually having a look at the full 3 hour one. It's very easy to book onto, and I can give details at the end. It is a very basic course. It's an entry level to people working with disabled people. So if you already have some experience of working in the disability sector, probably most of this is going to be fairly well known to you, but hopefully you can learn a few bits and pieces along the way. So as far as we're concerned, if you don't know about our organisation, we are a registered charity since 2013. And currently the kind of activities or the areas we're involved with are, first of all, we operate an award-winning network of community clubs across London. You may have heard of some, operating in 13 different London boroughs. So that's kind of our flagship service. We also have a coaching workforce that operate right across London, and they're delivering coaching sessions in a wide range of community settings, particularly in the educational sector in schools and colleges. We're also working with other organisations like charities, local authorities, etc. And then kind of what we're doing today. Oh, was that someone talking to me? Okay, I heard some noise. Okay. We also deliver training courses as well, which support mainly individuals, and that could be coaches or people, let's say, wanting to get into this particular field of work, and organisations as well. So in a kind of nutshell, that's what we're about. Today, what we're going to be looking at. So the outcomes, and so this is very abbreviated, and we're not going to haven't got a huge amount of time to spend on each of these areas, but hopefully by the end of the course, you're going to feel a little bit more confident about certain appropriate language and terminology within a disability context. We're going to have a quick look at 2 different models of disability. Some of, maybe you'll know about them already, perhaps it's completely new to you. We're going to quickly look at ways of how we can actually adapt and modify sport sessions for disabled people, and also just to look at some different methods of communication. So hopefully that's fairly relevant to what you're looking for today. But we're going to start with a quiz as a bit of an icebreaker. I should have said just now, has everyone, very quickly, if you want 30 seconds, if you can just get a pen and paper to hand, that'd be amazing. So I'll give you 30 seconds. Hopefully you've got some already, but if you haven't, don't worry, it's not the end of the world. You can always kind of just remember your answers. But if you want to quickly go and get pen and paper, do that now. Okay, so hopefully that's given you just a bit of time to get a pen and paper and say, don't worry if you haven't. We're not taking the answers from you. We don't want to know what, you're going to mark your own papers, so there's no pressure at all. This is just a bit of an icebreaker. So question number 1, there's 5 questions I might have mentioned. So question number 1, what is para short for in the word Paralympics? So what is para in Paralympics short for? And you've got multiple choice to make it easy for you. So is it A, does it stand for parasport? Is it B, parallel? Or is it C, paraplegic? So what do you reckon para is short for? Just give you a couple of seconds just to think about that. So if you just want to mark off on a piece of paper what your answer is, we'll come back to it later. Okay, question number 2. Where and when was the first official Paralympic Games held? So where was the first one? 3 choices again. So was it A, was it in 1960 in Rome? Was it B, Tel Aviv in 1968? Or was it C, in Toronto in 1976? I think, Lauren, you got 2 out of 2 already, haven't you? I hope so. I hope so.
I wish I do, but I think my knowledge is dusty.
Okay. Okay, so once again, so the first official Paralympics, those choices: Rome 1960, B, Tel Aviv 1968, or C, in Toronto 1976. So I hope you got an answer for that one. Question number 3. So the Paralympic football competition or tournament is played by people with what disability? It's one particular disability. So is it a tournament for A, people with a hearing impairment? Is it B, for wheelchair users? Or is it 3 or C, is it for visually impaired players? So the Paralympic soccer competition played by people with A, hearing impairments, B, for people who use wheelchairs, or C, for visually impaired footballers. Okay, think about that one, make your answer. Okay, question number 4. Okay, so this is a description of a Paralympic sport. So it's 3-a-side, it's played in complete silence, and an audible ball is used. So what do you think that might be a description of? Which particular Paralympic sport? So 3 clues. It's kind of 3-a-side, it's played in silence and uses an audible ball. 3 options. Is it A, is it wheelchair rugby? Is it B, sitting volleyball? Or is it C, goalball? Okay, just give you a second just to have a think about that. Okay, and then finally, last, beg pardon, 2 more. Yeah, 2 more questions. Next question. So where is the 2021 Paralympics going to be held? So where's the next Paralympics going to be? 3 choices as usual. So are we looking at A, Los Angeles? Are we looking at B, Tokyo? Or are we looking at C, Paris? So the next Paralympics now scheduled for next year. Venue will be A, Los Angeles, B, Tokyo, or C, Paris. Okay, and just finally, last question. So anyone know which GB competitor has won Paralympic gold medals in two events? Quite amazing. So those events are swimming and cycling, very, very different activities, but someone's won gold medals in both. Here are choices. Is it A, Sarah Story? Is it B, Dame Tanni Grey-Thompson? Or is it C, Ellie Simmons? So as I say, GB competitor, Paralympic golds in 2 events, swimming and cycling. A, Sarah Story, B, Dame Tanni Grey-Thompson, or C, Ellie Simmons. Okay, if you want to make your choices there, and we'll just quickly rattle through to the beginning. Okay, so very quickly. So in Paralympics, if you put answer as B, parallel, you'd be absolutely right. Okay, so this comes from an inclusive, something called the inclusion spectrum model, which kind of shows a range of activities. From at one end, we have fully inclusive activity at one end, and the other we have completely segregated activity for disability, for people with a disability, and with various kind of different things going on in the middle of that spectrum. And one of those is what we call parallel activity. So in essence, what we're talking about here is that the Paralympics runs alongside or in parallel with the Olympics. So they're 2 events that, huge events that pretty much mirror each other in most of the activities that go on. They're not competed for at the same time, but they actually run parallel to each other. So B is parallel. That's where we get the para from in Paralympics. So well done if you got that right. Second question was, where was the first official Paralympics held? Well, it was actually held back in Rome in 1960. That was the very first one, really small event compared with what it's like now, but that's where it all kicked off. So well done if you got Italy 1960 as your answer. Next question was about the football competition. What impairment, people with which particular impairment would play football at the Paralympics? Well, the answer is C. So it's actually specifically for visually impaired players. Although the goalkeeper is always sighted, I believe, Connor, correct me if I'm wrong there, actually a sighted keeper, five-a-side event. So well done if you got C, visually impaired. Next question was around a description, three-a-side, played in complete silence and uses an audible ball. What sport? Again, if you got C, goal ball, you'd be absolutely spot on. So again, goal ball, you may have come across goal ball, really exciting game, really dynamic, fast and furious, but strange in that it's played in complete silence. That's one of the key sort of characteristics. It couldn't be played otherwise because obviously the competitors need to be able to hear where the ball's going to. So strange in that respect, but well done if you got C for goal ball. Where's the next Paralympics going to be held? Hopefully you've picked up it in the news over the recent sort of months with its postponement. It's actually going to be in Tokyo, hopefully next summer. So Tokyo summer 21 is the venue for the next Paralympics. And just finally, the competitor who's won gold medals in 2 events, once again, if you got A, Sarah Story, you'd be spot on. So you may have heard of the other 2 very, very famous Paralympic athletes, Dame Tanni Gray and swimmer Ellie Simmonds, both of whom have won many gold medals in their own right in athletics and swimming, respectively. But Sarah has won golds in 2 particular disciplines. So well done for that. So I hope that's kind of warmed you up, just got you thinking about disability sport. But now we're actually going to move on to kind of the main course itself. And I think it's always good to start with a definition. So what is our current definition of a disability? This is what you see on the screen. It's our legal definition of disability. It's set out in, as you can see, the Equality Act, which was a piece of legislation passed back in 2010. It supersedes the old Disability Discrimination Act. And the definition, I'll just quickly read it through and we'll have a look at it in a little bit more detail. So the definition is, disability is a physical or mental impairment which has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on a person's ability to carry out day-to-day activities. So there's our legal definition. I just want to pick up on a couple of words and phrases in there which are pretty key, really. The first one, which you can see emboldened, is the word mental. And this is because from 2010, we started to incorporate mental health conditions, mental health illnesses into our definition of disability. Probably long overdue. It's something that many people for many years have struggled with. Mental health conditions have been around a long time, but really only recently, relatively recently, recognised as a disability in their own right. And as a result of that, people can then actually start to access various other services, grants, etc. But what it also does is actually puts out the number of people generally that could actually say they have a disability, and actually kind of really increases that overall figure. But a key addition there. The second thing I want to just draw attention to is the word long-term. Long-term there is quite vague. What does long-term mean? Well, in the case of our definition, our legal definition, it actually means a minimum of 12 months. So it's kind of a year. So to demonstrate that you actually have a disability, whether it's a physical disability or a mental impairment, as we say there, you need to demonstrate that you've had that particular issue or difficulty for at least a minimum of 12 months. So, we often get the question, well, okay, I know someone who broke their leg playing football, a few months ago, and they were completely debilitated by it. It was awful injury. But fortunately, they were back playing football in 6 months. Did they have a disability? The answer under our definition here is no, they didn't have a disability, but in that they were kind of getting back and playing activities again within half a year. So whilst it must have been desperately difficult, frustrating, inconvenient, etc., in the eyes of the law, that kind of injury would not be deemed to be a disability. As opposed to someone who has a niggling kind of chronic back problem that you may not be aware of, but someone just struggles from day to day. They really find it hard to stand up for too long, find work harder as a result. People might think, well, that kind of doesn't sound that serious. But if it is, and if it starts to, as we move on to the next bold and bolden phrase, it starts to affect your ability to do day-to-day activities, then we start to get into the realms of actually someone having a disability. So day-to-day activities, no kind of, nothing kind of unusual here. We're talking about getting up in the morning, using the bathroom, getting dressed, going to work, going to the shops, all those kind of things that we generally take for granted. If that becomes a real serious issue and you really find it hard to undertake those type of activities because of a physical or a mental impairment, then once again you're starting to seriously look at having a disability in your own right. So that definition is really important, and it's referred to an awful lot as a reference, as a legal reference point. So it's very important. Okay, so let's move on. Just one slide of key facts. I think it's very important to try to get a perspective on actually the number of people we reckon in the UK are actually disabled. Now, these figures seem to vary an awful lot. You'll pick up on a lot of research, a lot of different surveys where we get quite a lot of fluctuating numbers for a number of reasons. But we reckon this particular source of information is relatively accurate. So what we're saying here on the first bullet point is that we reckon a year or so ago, anyway, through the Family Resources Survey, there were just over 14 million disabled people in the UK. And that represents just over 20% of the total population. I remember a few years ago when I kind of saw that figure, I was quite astounded that 1 in 5 people actually would tick the boxes in terms of actually having a disability. I think it's a huge figure. And one of the reasons we kind of mentioned earlier about mental health being included within that stat, our definition of physical disability has really changed as well over a number of years to now include people who have what we call a long-term limiting health problem. So now within that, with that overarching kind of definition of disability, we now include people that have had a stroke, for example, have long-term cardio, heart problems. People have got diabetes. So those kind of long-term physical health issues are now included within that figure, and that considerably bumps things up. People within, with those particular illnesses do struggle. Life is generally pretty tough at times. And so again, they would qualify for actually being having a statement of being disabled. So pretty high figure. I think the middle point's really interesting as well. And it's something that many years ago I didn't realise, in that disability or the prevalence of disability rises with age. I used to think many years ago that most people were born with a disability. Well, this stat really shows that's not the case. So what we're saying here is that a year or so ago, 8% of all children were disabled. They had a disability. By the time people have got to a working age, that figure has risen to 17%. And then really quite alarmingly, I think in a lot of ways, that by the time people reach sort of state pension age, which is kind of middle to late 60s, you're getting on for almost 50% of people within that age group are actually deemed to have a disability. And as a society, our population starts to get older and older, that figure is inevitably going to rise. And that has a lot of implications, particularly in terms of support, sort of health support, NHS services, etc., where we are trying to support people with disability into later life. And just quickly, just to give you a breakdown across some of the impairment groups of how that 14.1 million people is calculated. Roughly speaking, we're looking at just over 6 million people would have a physical or a mobility problem. 2.5 million would have a sensory impairment. That means either a sight problem or a hearing difficulty. Around about 3.5 million would fall under the category of having a mental health problem, and just under 2 million people with a learning disability. So that's roughly how we actually build up to that 14.1 million people. Okay, so that's the only stats I'm going to throw at you today, but I think very important ones as well. What's really important and what has changed an awful lot over years is our attitude, whether that's as an individual or a societal attitude towards people with disabilities. And the way that we perceive, regard, think about disability, and particularly disabled people, really then does have an impact on disabled people's outcomes and how they're actually treated generally within society. So actually how we think at any one time, and particularly collectively how we think about disability in its broadest sense, will inevitably have quite a significant bearing on the lives of disabled people themselves. And kind of just to show changing attitudes over a number of years, I want to share with you a couple of theoretical models of disability. And we're going to start with one which is called the medical model. And this goes back a number of years. It was probably at the turn of the 20th century, so over 100 years ago, when people started to think about disability in a medical sense or a scientific sense. And essentially the argument went that a person with a disability really defined who a person was. It was the first kind of thing you should think about when you're actually sort of talking to someone who has an impairment. It's kind of who they are. And essentially the medical world was saying that that person will be stuck with where they are, stuck with the status quo, stuck with that impairment, for as long as it takes for science and medicine to find a cure or a solution. So if someone's born with impairment, that's their lot. They have to deal with that the best they can until science comes along and finds a cure. So for example, just giving a little example of a statement that might kind of reflect that medical way of thinking. So we got someone who wants to play football, but she can't join the local football club because she's blind. It's a kind of very stark, very blinkered kind of approach. Someone can't do something because they have a disability. And that's how it stays until the medical sector, biological world, whatever, actually come along and find a solution. Now, when we kind of sort of ask in our longer course, how does that sound? Most people are quite kind of appalled by that approach. As I say, it's quite cold, it's quite lacking in empathy and sympathy. And it's a very sort of clinical, literally a clinical approach to disability. Now, fortunately, in a lot of ways, as the 20th century progressed, particularly into the kind of 1950s, 60s and onwards, a lot of enlightened people really started to challenge that medical model, and they thought there was an awful lot of unfairness. They kind of started to question the morality of that particular medical approach. And they thought that, you know, disabled people really being sold short here. They, you know, why should you accept the status quo? Surely, for sure, it's great if medicine can find solutions, but surely society has a responsibility as well to helping out, not stand by and just wait. How can society intervene to make life easier for a disabled person? For a number of reasons, from a legal point of view nowadays, but again, from a moral, but also from an economic responsibility. Many disabled people, most disabled people have talents, and why not use those talents rather than kind of just wait, put them to one side until, say, medicine comes along and finds a solution. So with the social model, things are tipped on their head, and we actually now start to say that it's society that has the problem, has the disability, if we cannot find ways of accommodating and including disabled people within the workplace, within education, within sport, etc. So the whole thing's flipped on its head. And the idea therefore is for society to remove those barriers, to allow disabled people to become way more independent and to actually flourish and use all those talents that we know they have. So kind of a nice example to sum that up at the end there is a wheelchair user can play at a local football club. And the reason why is because the coach there actually knows how to adapt his coaching sessions. So we're recognizing there's a person with additional needs, but we're now actually finding a solution, a societal solution through a coach being upskilled to be able to include a wheelchair user within that particular coaching session. So a real fundamental shift in attitude, and one which is way more positive, it's more progressive, it's more enlightened, and it's society taking responsibility, not sitting back. So a real kind of key shift in attitude. Now, what I want you to do very quickly, you can just do on this own. We've got 4 statements on the slide here. And I want you to quickly have a look at each of those statements. I'll read them out in a minute. And I want you to see if you can kind of match up what statement represents which of those 2 medical models that we've been looking at. Okay, what one you think better reflects my kind of definitions of both of those. First of all, top left. So first statement. I can't go up to the 2nd floor of a sports venue because my impairment stops me from climbing the stairs. Okay, so we move across to top right. I can go to the 2nd floor of a sports venue because a lift's been installed. Okay, so bottom left, I can join a water rowing session because the instructor does know how to adapt a session to meet blind people's needs. And 4th, bottom right, I can't join a water rowing session because I'm blind. So just spend 30 seconds or so just having a look at those statements and have a kind of just tick down where you think or what reflects which particular model against each of those statements. Another 10 seconds or so. Okay, so just let's have a quick look. So first one, top left, I can't go to the 2nd floor of sports venue because my impairment stops me from doing that. That really relates back to that kind of medical model. We're highlighting the fact that someone has a disability, but there's no kind of solution. That's it. That's full stop. That's the end of the story. You're kind of limited. A disabled person cannot access, and that's the end of the conversation, essentially. More kind of relates to that medical model feel. Okay, so well done if you put medical against that one. Move across the right-hand side. We're looking now, I can go to that 2nd floor because a lift's been installed. A really good example here of where there's been an intervention, not a medical intervention, but kind of an engineering one. Actually now a lift's there, which is actually making that 2nd floor accessible. So we've got a kind of more of a social responsibility there, more of a social model approach to someone's particular issue. So social would be against that particular statement. And then bottom left, I can join a water rowing session because the instructor can adapt sessions. Again, we had that kind of example earlier when we looked at the other slide on, again, a social model of disability, in that we're actually identifying this problem, but we're actually finding a solution as well. So more enlightened approach. And then finally, just bottom right, once again, I can't join a water rowing session because I'm blind. Again, a fairly a bleak kind of outlook there. Someone's just written off, no solution because they have a disability, and no one's going to find a solution to that problem. So hopefully in that goes kind of 4 statements, we start to get that kind of real shift in attitude, as I mentioned, and one that's can only be for the better as we become more enlightened as a society and more inclusive as a society. Okay, so there was quickly whizzed through 2 kind of theoretical models, and hopefully I've explained the difference and that kind of shift, that really fundamental shift towards that social model in recent years. Okay, so we're going to move on to the second sort of section really of the course now, and I've got a little task lined up for you. And this is again where your pen and paper, if you've got one, will be ever so handy. So if you've got your pen and paper, what I want you to do is basically divide your page into 2 columns, and I want you to head up one of those columns as shown on the slide as use, and then on the other column on your page I want you to give it a title of avoid. And what we're going to do now, we're going to start to look at some language, the linguistic significance within a sort of disability context of the kind of words that we use. And once you've got your use and avoid columns, now I'm just going to throw a slide at you which has got lots of words and statements, and they are completely random on that slide. There's no kind of logic to where they appear. And what my challenge to you is just spend a few minutes just actually going through each of those words or phrases in turn. And I want you to see where you think they best fit under either of your 2 columns. So whether you think it's a word or phrase that you would use in modern day society, or whether it's a word you think, not sure about, don't think I should be using that word within a disability context anymore. So that will be in the avoid column. Okay. So just spend a few minutes, have a think of those, and just try to get them into the orders that you kind of think, or the columns that you think are most appropriate. Okay, off you go. Okay, just another minute or so. Don't worry if you don't finish it. But, do your best you can in the very limited time that we've got. Okay, just a little bit longer, and we'll start to move on. Okay, so let's have a quick look at how your ideas, your suggestions sort of match up with the ones that I've got on my next slide. I always find this a really kind of quite a difficult part of the course to our disability awareness course to deliver, because language is so is always evolving. It's such a fluid kind of issue that it's amazing how quickly words and phrases become from socially acceptable to socially unacceptable. And it's something you really need to be working very close within this particular sector when we look at these kind of words and phrases, to really kind of keep on top of what is acceptable to use and what isn't. You can't go to a kind of definitive dictionary of disability. It just kind of doesn't exist. And so you need to really keep sort of track of current affairs, you know, kind of listen to relevant TV, kind of documentaries, whatever, radio shows, that you'll start to quickly get a feel for those words and phrases which are quite current, they're quite topical, they're quite acceptable to those that have kind of moved on. And I think probably for this exercise, it's maybe more beneficial to actually look at the avoid side, our red column here, to kind of just have a look at those words which we would now deem, generally speaking, and again, there is some subjectivity here, but generally speaking, we wouldn't probably feel comfortable using anymore. And I think some kind of stand out, they're kind of glaringly, they make you feel very uncomfortable, even the kind of thought of using something like cripple these days, or peg leg. And the reason is that they have such a negative connotation to them. They're really kind of quite insulting. There's something about that sort of language these days that we just find, you know, you wouldn't even dream about starting to use some of those words. Whilst there are others which are a bit more sort of borderline, and you might have, I could have actually asked you to have a column down the middle with kind of not sure. And a good example of that is actually handicapped. Handicapped is a word that, generally speaking, for a number of years now, within the UK, we wouldn't use. Again, it has too many negative inferences, and the word disabled or disability has sort of taken its place. However, if you went to America, you would quite quickly hear our friends across the Atlantic talking about handicapped people very naturally, very confidently. And there's no kind of issue with that particular word. It hasn't got that negative connotation within, you know, within the current American culture. So there are kind of cultural considerations as well here. We would tend to avoid words like challenged as well. I think a few years ago, kind of mentally challenged would probably be okay. I think a few years ago, we would have used vertically challenged. But again, that seems to be a bit more kind of passé. Again, it's got, you know, challenge, that shows kind of something wrong, there's a kind of problem. So again, we try to veer away from the word challenged in any particular description. Wheelchair bound's an interesting one. Sometimes people say, okay, well, you know, what's wrong with that? My answer to that will be, it tends to imply that someone's physically kind of just actually stuck in a wheelchair. They can't move at all, they can't get up at all, which in many cases, that's not the case. People do want to use their wheelchair from time to time, but they're not kind of literally tied to it 24 hours a day. So wheelchair user on the left-hand side is a more appropriate term than someone who's actually wheelchair bound in a wheelchair. Again, fairly negative thing to say. So again, don't worry if you didn't get all those right. You know, it's something, you know, as you move into and spend more time in the sector, you'll quickly understand and get a feel, an instinctive feel, I think, for those words and phrases which are okay, which probably aren't acceptable. But as I mentioned before, if we'd had this discussion maybe 25, 30 years ago, perhaps arguably all those words we stuck in our avoid column would have been acceptable. And it just shows how things are constantly moving on. And in a few years' time, some of those words which are in the use column, and say, I think at the moment we can use those and feel confident about using those words, will become, as I say, passé and move to that kind of avoid column. It's that evolutionary that our language is continually using. But the one thing I'd say above all this is, it's better to have a go and have conversations with disabled people rather than get so hung up on words and terminology that you don't have that conversation in the first place. It's more insulting to actually avoid someone and think, oh, I'm going to say the wrong word, I'm going to really offend them, than say nothing at all. Most disabled people, if they are offended by what you say, will be very, very polite and very courteous and may just address it. They may not even say anything at all, or may just say, yeah, I prefer not to be called that or referred to in that particular kind of language. But generally speaking, they would much rather you have a go, make some mistakes along the way, but get stuck in and have a conversation. And I can't stress that enough. I think a lot of people would get so hung up on language that they almost kind of take the easy route and just avoid it altogether. And that's not what we're saying in this course. Learn as best as you can around the words that are acceptable and those that aren't, but if you can't, have a go. It's something, when I worked for a national charity that supported blind and partially sighted people, we were always at pains to say, if you're having a conversation with someone who's visually impaired, don't worry about using words see, watch. You know, they're common words, you know, that they kick off a conversation. Did you watch the game last night? Did you see the match? That's not going to offend 99% of visually impaired people. There's going to be that occasional one who may say, well, no, I didn't see it because my sight's not good. But generally, they'll kind of take it in the right spirit. It's actually just so natural language that we use. And we don't want to try to avoid too much natural language, because then it starts to affect the flow of our communication. So just a little bit on language. As I say, it's something you need to kind of just start to sort of learn yourself and start to get that instinctive feel for perhaps what's usable and what's avoidable. Okay, thanks for having a go at that. So communication. So we had a little look at language. Now we're going to look at communication. And on the slide here, we've got the fact that communication is actually divided into two kind of separate categories. It's verbal, or it's actually non-verbal. And this has quite a lot of significance where we're dealing or working with disabled people who may have a particular preference or might find one of those elements more beneficial than others. So what I want you to do quickly, just have a quick think of how many different types of verbal and non-verbal communication you can think of. Please don't overthink this. You know, don't necessarily at the moment think about it within a sort of disability context. Just actually think about, when we're talking about verbal communication, what do we mean? Or non-verbal, well, actually, what do we mean? And if you just would quickly spend a minute or so just coming up with a kind of list for each of those, and then we'll kind of check back and see how that kind of links with some of the things that I've got on my next slide. Okay. Okay, another 15 seconds or so. Okay, so let's just move on. So hopefully on your kind of list, your answer sheet there, you might have picked up on a few bits and pieces that kind of mirror some of the things that I've got on my slide here. So when we look at verbal, really straightforward. Verbal is about speech, it's about talking, it's about language. That can then be subdivided into types of conversation. So whether that's a private one-to-one chat, or whether it's a debate, one-sided, one person speaking to someone else who's just listening, or it can be very interactive kind of group discussion. So there's some examples of verbal communication. Now, perhaps kind of arguably for this particular course, non-verbal's a little bit more interesting, and we have to think a bit hard about actually what we mean by non-verbal. And again, just initially, a very superficial level, we can say, well, non-verbal is about not talking. It's about how we actually express ourselves without actually talking. And here are some ideas of how we do that. So, for example, body language. It's been argued for many years that, quite controversially, I think now, that 80%, it's kind of deemed that 80% of the way that we communicate effectively is actually through non-verbal communication. So it's not actually about what we say, it's about our tone, how we say it. It's about our language, our posture, whether we look hostile, whether we're smiling and look really kind of happy, whether we look bored or whether we look tired, whether we are nodding, whether we're using symbols, we're touching someone on the shoulder, using hands or gestures. And I think so the combination of all these non-verbal cues and methods of communication are particularly relevant for some impairment groups. So for argument's sake, if we're looking at blind and partially sighted people, they are going to have all kinds of issues picking up on body language. They're going to be far more dependent on you using good linguistic skills, good vocabulary, good speech, rather than body language. So if you're talking to, or a visually impaired person is talking to you and you're just nodding and nodding or shaking your head, a lot of that is lost. You know, if someone has got very, very limited sight, they're not going to pick up, so they don't know how you're reacting and interpreting what they're actually saying to you. So we need some more verbal cues there if we're dealing with someone who has a sight problem. And obviously vice versa, when we're looking at kind of other impairment groups as well. So, someone who's hearing impaired is going to be kind of really kind of pleased to see whether you're smiling or you're frowning, or you're happy, you're sad, etc. That's what they're going to be picking up on. A lot of those facial expressions are absolutely key. So we can kind of quickly think that when we're actually communicating with disabled people, we have to be at times far more kind of aware, sort of self-aware of what we're saying, how we're saying it, and kind of our gestures, hand symbols, etc., all very, very important. And as I say, probably on balance, the non-verbal communication is probably just a little bit more important than the verbal, and that goes for all of us in whatever context. So well done if you got a few of those examples. So now we're just going to quickly move on, sticking with communication methods. I just want you to have a think about if you can think of any particular communication methods and aids that could actually be used in a very supportive way for these particular groups of disabled people. So have a think of any aids that you may have either heard of or actually used yourself for supporting people with a hearing impairment. Or second category would be people with a visual impairment, or people with a learning disability, or finally, people that have a physical impairment. So if you just want to have a minute or so, just coming up with hopefully maybe a couple of examples under each of those particular headings. So kind of communication methods, think about technology maybe a little bit, that could be a bit of a cue for you. Okay. Okay, just another 30 seconds or so. Okay, so let's just move on to my slide. So here are just a few examples, things that I kind of could think of when we're actually looking at those communication methods and aids. So for example, if we're looking at working with or trying to support people with a hearing impairment, these have been around a long time. They get more sophisticated, things like hearing aids, obviously vital. BSL, that stands for British Sign Language. So again, we've seen, hopefully seen a lot of interpreters actually supporting disabled people actually using sign language BSL. Most buildings, modern buildings, will have some sort of audio induction loop system that kind of uses the same frequency as someone's hearing aid and sort of helps to amplify sound. And good old text messages. Hearing people are more than happy to have a great sort of text conversation with you. So mobile phones are another example of a communication aid to help people who are hard of hearing. Visual impairments, okay, so there are some examples here. Braille, which is an incredibly old, established way of communicating using dot signs sort of, or raised dots on a page. Although very, very few people these days, I think it's probably only 2 or 3% of people with a sight impairment would actually read Braille. It's a fairly antiquated sort of method of communication now. We can always, I think, we get some of the members asking if they can just send their emails in a larger font, a more bold font, which is easier to read, which is very easy to do now with current technology. I've been to a couple of matches with some visually impaired people and had some fantastic audio commentaries at football matches. So someone with a sight impairment gets their own personal commentary on the game that's actually organised by the local or the host football club, which is fantastic. It makes them feel far more engaged in the match. You have easy readers, kind of on computers now, computers which will actually sort of just read out emails for or any kind of text for someone who's got a visual impairment. So just a few examples there. People with a learning disability, generally speaking, they may struggle with language, particular words, particularly if they're long, kind of ambiguous words. So when we're thinking about language, again, try to keep it simple. But again, a lot of people with a learning disability will respond really well to whether it's kind of signs, symbols, kind of picture books, cards, a far more visual approach to your method of communication. So that's very important to bear in mind if you're actually working with people with a learning disability. Physically impaired people is quite an interesting one because we probably don't have to do too much adaptation at times. They don't necessarily need to have a lot of different sort of aids or kind of gadgets or whatever. Most people purely with a physical impairment will be able to kind of talk to you or be able to read, etc., etc. But one sort of thing that we're constantly asked is about, okay, if I'm standing and talking to someone in a wheelchair, should I kind of really try to get on the same level as them? What's the kind of deal there? So kind of positioning when we're actually communicating or in conversation with someone who's kind of lower than you. Our kind of rule of thumb is probably the ideal scenario, if it works, is if there's a seat or a chair next to the wheelchair user, just plop yourself in that chair and have that chat. That feels quite natural. What we would tend not to suggest is kind of to start to stoop down or bend down, because you're actually kind of then making, you're kind of just raising someone's awareness that, you're at different heights. And again, you can do it. It's not kind of the end of the world if you do it, but just be happy with your particular posture, nice open body language, very welcoming, an appropriate distance apart from that particular person, just strike up your conversation that way. So again, not a huge amount of adaptation for people just purely with a physical impairment. So well done if you got some of those particular examples. I've certainly had others that are way better than mine, so well done if you have. We've literally got time for our last slide. I hope, Lauren, I'm not going to run over too much. I'm certainly looking at the watch very...
yeah, I think you've got about a minute, Hugh. I'm just conscious because I don't know if we can actually start the next session until this one's finished. So
quickly, what I do, we can share these slides we do. I just wanted to share very quickly a model called STEPS, which is a fantastic way of thinking about adapting sport and physical activity in a coaching kind of setup. To make sure we are really inclusive and accessible in the way that we deliver our coaching session. And it's called STEPS, and you can look down the left-hand column. STEPS stands for space, task, equipment, people, and speed. And we always use this as a really good kind of aid for our coaches when they're starting to work with maybe a new set of disabled participants. So we get them thinking about the kind of space there is in the hall where they may be. Really important at times to kind of reduce that space if you're working with people that are new to an activity or aren't particularly active, and therefore they can't do too much running around. So space is really important. We need to think about the task. Where we can simplify the task. So don't make it too technical, don't make it too difficult with the kind of official rules and regulations. We can sort of dilute those down to make it far more accessible. Equipment, we can get a lot of accessible equipment anyway, kind of bigger balls, softer footballs, audible footballs, kind of lighter cricket bats, bigger tennis rackets. So where we can change and modify equipment, we should do that. Key to any coach within any context is just think about the person, think about your participants, think about their needs, think about their interests, think about their ability levels. So P is for people. And then finally, speed. We may need, when we're working with disabled people who haven't done a particular activity before, to kind of really just slow the pace of the session down. Don't expect too much too soon. Be really patient and just slow. Just be really conscious about your speed. Progress and regress accordingly. And again, that's a kind of great model for whoever you're working with in a coaching context, but particularly working with disabled people. I've rattled through that. Would have liked to spend a couple more minutes, but I apologise if I've spent too long on the rest. But so thank you ever so much. I hope we've kind of covered the areas that I spoke about at the beginning of the session in terms of language communication, attitudes, etc., etc. So there we go. Thank you for listening. There's a group of people that have done our course a couple of years ago, looking happy and kind of more confident about engaging now with disabled people, particularly in a sports context. So thank you so much. Over to you, Lauren.
Thank you so much, Hugh. I mean, that was really helpful. As Hugh said earlier on, DSC do some other courses. You've got some online courses if you're still running them, Hugh, and then more face-to-face courses. So if you want to get in touch with him about any courses that you might want to run for your organisation or any public courses, I'll send everyone the link to that and their website and Hugh's email. But yeah, thanks everyone for joining. We don't have time for any question and answers, but if you've got any questions, feel free to just send them to me and I can link you up with Hugh. But other than that, thanks Hugh, thanks everybody else for joining on. We've got another few sessions this afternoon.